I'm Maria. My family is full of linguists, and languages were a big part of my life growing up. My mom and dad were both professors, always talking about the nuances of different languages at the dinner table. I guess it rubbed off on me because by the time I finished college, I could speak 5 languages fluently: English, Spanish, French, German, and Italian. I met David when I was still in college. He was in my circle of friends, and we clicked right away. David is tall, with dark hair and a kind smile that always made me feel at ease. He came from a wealthy family, which always seemed to be a point of stress for him. His parents, Mr. and Mrs. Anderson, were very clear about wanting him to join the family business as a financier, but David had other plans. David and I used to hang out a lot, sharing our dreams and frustrations. He would often vent about his parents' pressure. "Maria, I just can't see myself crunching numbers all day," he'd say, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I want to work with animals, help them. That's what makes me happy." David secretly started volunteering at a local vet clinic, learning everything he could about animal care. He was so passionate about it, and I admired that about him. He was determined to make his dream come true, even if it meant going against his parents' wishes. "Maria, you should have seen this little puppy today. It was so scared, but once I calmed it down, it was all wagging tails and happy barks," he'd say, his face lighting up with joy. "That's amazing, David. You're doing something really special," I'd respond, genuinely happy for him. We were just friends, but I always felt a deep connection with David. We understood each other in a way that was rare. I loved languages, and he loved animals, but we both shared a passion for following our dreams. As graduation approached, David's parents intensified their pressure, and he became more conflicted. But through it all, we supported each other. We'd often meet up to vent and encourage one another. "You've got this, David," I'd say, giving him a reassuring smile. "You're going to be an amazing vet someday. And you, Maria, are going to be the best translator out there," he'd reply with a grin. It was a typical Friday night, and our group of friends decided to have a little get-together. We gathered at John's place, a cozy apartment that was perfect for our small party. There was a good amount of wine, some snacks, and lots of laughter. David and I were there, as usual, sharing stories and enjoying each other's company. "Maria, you've got to try this wine," David said, handing me a glass. "It's from a vineyard in France, supposed to be really good." "All right, but only if you promise not to let me get too tipsy," I replied with a grin, taking the glass from him. We talked for hours, our conversation flowing effortlessly. It felt different that night, more intimate, like we were seeing each other in a new light. As the party started to wind down, we found ourselves sitting on the couch, a little apart from the rest of the group. "Maria, do you ever think about what it would be like if we were more than friends?" David asked suddenly, his voice soft but serious. I was taken aback by his question, my heart pounding in my chest. I've thought about it, David," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Before I knew it, we were leaning in, and then our lips met in a gentle kiss. It was electric, like something out of a movie. We pulled back, staring at each other in shock and wonder. "Wow," David said, his voice shaky. "I didn't expect that." "Me neither," I replied, feeling a blush creep up my cheeks. "But I'm not complaining." We sat there for a moment, the air between us charged with a new kind of tension. It was like the room around us faded away, leaving just the two of us in our own little world. "Do you want to get out of here?" David asked, his eyes never leaving mine. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We quietly slipped out of the apartment, hand in hand, and made our way to his place. The walk there was filled with nervous laughter and stolen glances, both of us trying to process what had just happened. We went inside, and the next few hours were a blur of kisses, laughter, and whispered confessions. It was like we were finally allowing ourselves to feel what we had been holding back for so long. Everything felt right, like we were exactly where we were supposed to be. The next morning, I woke up in David's arms, feeling a mix of happiness and nervousness. I gently nudged him awake, needing to talk about what had happened. "David, wake up," I whispered, shaking his shoulder gently. He stirred, opening his eyes and giving me a sleepy smile. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning," I replied, feeling my cheeks heat up. "We need to talk about last night." After that romantic night, David and I decided we didn't want to wait any longer. We wanted to get married. We were so sure of our love, but we knew his parents might be a hurdle. When we told them, Mr. and Mrs. Anderson weren't thrilled. They had known me for years as David's friend, but as his wife? That was a different story. They didn't like that I wasn't from a wealthy family. Still, they agreed to our wedding but insisted on a prenuptial agreement. They wanted to make sure I wouldn't claim any of David's money. "You'll need to sign this prenup, Maria," Mr. Anderson said, handing me the documents. "It's just to protect the family assets." I glanced at David, who nodded reassuringly. "I understand," I said, taking the papers. Despite the cold reception, they allowed us to live in David's late grandmother's apartment. It was a beautiful place in the city center, with windows overlooking the square. The apartment was elite and expensive, with excellent repairs and new furniture. It felt like a fresh start. After the wedding, we moved in, but Mr. Anderson made it clear that one room, filled with his mother's belongings, was off limits. "Those items are priceless to me, Maria," he said sternly, handing me the key. "You are not to enter that room." I nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. "I won't, Mr. Anderson. I promise." With that, David and I began our new life together, ready to face whatever challenges came our way. Living with David was like a dream at first. We were so happy in our new place, but soon enough, that bliss got a serious jolt thanks to his sister, Laura. Laura started dropping by unannounced, making herself right at home. One Saturday morning, just as I was getting ready to enjoy a peaceful breakfast, she showed up. "Hey Maria," Laura said, strolling into the kitchen without even knocking. "What's for breakfast?" I forced a smile, trying to keep my annoyance in check. "Good morning, Laura. I was just about to make some eggs." "Make enough for me too, will you?" she said, plopping down at the table and scrolling through her phone like she owned the place. I took a deep breath and started cooking, reminding myself to stay calm. David walked in, looking a bit surprised to see his sister. "Laura, didn't know you were coming over," he said, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah, thought I'd surprise you guys," she said with a smirk. "This place is amazing. I could get used to hanging out here more often." As days went by, Laura's visits became more frequent and more invasive. She'd stay over without asking, and every morning it was the same thing. She'd demand breakfast, criticize my cooking, and make snide comments about me living in her grandmother's apartment. "Maria, you should really learn how to cook better," she said one morning, pushing her plate away. "You're living here on borrowed time, you know." That was the last straw. I clenched my fists and looked her straight in the eye. "Laura, you can't just come here and disrespect me in my own home." She scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Your home? This is my family's apartment, Maria. You're just here because my parents are too nice to kick you out." David had enough. He walked over and stood next to me, glaring at Laura. "Laura, you need to show Maria some respect. She's my wife, and this is her home too." Laura's face twisted in anger. Of course you'd take her side. Mom and Dad always loved you more, gave you everything, and now you're letting her take what's left. "Enough, Laura." David's voice was firm. "If you can't respect Maria, then don't come here anymore." Laura stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I let out a sigh of relief, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. David hugged me, whispering, "We'll get through this, I promise." The next day, my phone rang, and it was my mother-in-law. She didn't even bother with pleasantries. "Maria, I've heard terrible things about how you're keeping the apartment," she snapped. "Laura says it's a mess, and you're not being a good hostess." I was stunned. Mrs. Anderson, that's not true. I've been doing my best to keep the place clean and welcoming. Clearly, your best isn't good enough, she retorted. We're very disappointed with David's choice to marry you. We think you should consider leaving. When I told David about the conversation, he was furious. They have no right to talk to you like that, Maria. We'll figure something out. Days turned into weeks, and the tension with David's family kept building. Laura continued her visits, though less frequent after David's outburst. She still managed to make every interaction a challenge. As the days passed, I focused on keeping our home a sanctuary, a place where David and I could escape from the outside world and his family's constant scrutiny. We knew we had to stick together and stay strong, no matter what challenges came our way. David worked for his father's company, but I was having a hard time finding a job as a translator. I went for interviews, but the jobs offered were way below my skills and pay expectations. One evening, I was home alone, feeling a bit down about another unsuccessful interview. I was just about to get comfortable when I heard the door unlock. I wasn't expecting anyone, so my heart jumped into my throat. In walked David's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Anderson, without so much as a knock. They just strolled in, acting like they owned the place, which technically, they did. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to hide my annoyance and shock. "You could have at least called." Mrs. Anderson looked around, her face twisted in disdain. "We don't need to call, before coming into our own apartment." "What if I was naked?" I shot back. "You can't just barge in like this." Mr. Anderson ignored me, looking around with a critical eye. "We've decided to install surveillance cameras to make sure you're keeping it in order." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Cameras? You're kidding, right? This is our home, not a prison." Just then, David came home, looking tired but quickly realizing something was wrong. "What's going on?" he asked, glancing between me and his parents. "We're installing cameras," his father declared. "To keep an eye on how things are being maintained here." David's face turned red with anger. "This is ridiculous. You can't do that." "Yes, we can," Mr. Anderson snapped. "You owe everything to us. You should be grateful and keep quiet." Mrs. Anderson turned to me, her eyes cold. "You're a gold digger, Maria. You don't even have a job. You're just living off my son's money." That was the final straw. I looked straight at David and said, "I can't do this anymore. I want a divorce. I'm leaving." David's eyes widened in shock, but then he nodded. "If you leave, I'm going with you," he said, his voice steady. Mr. Anderson's face turned even redder. "If you walk out, you're cut off. No inheritance, no support." Mrs. Anderson added, "We'll move Laura in here for better control." That's when I had an idea. I winked at David and whispered, "Trust me, play along." David gave a slight nod. "All right, we'll get a divorce," he said, turning to his parents. They looked pleased with themselves. "Good," Mr. Anderson said. "We'll install the cameras and give Maria a month to find another place." Mrs. Anderson smirked. "You're doing the right thing, David. We'll have Laura move in next week." After David's parents left, he turned to me with a confused look. "Maria, why did you agree to a divorce and ask me to play along?" he asked, his eyes full of worry. I gave him a reassuring smile. "Just trust me, David. Do what I ask, and it'll all make sense soon." He sighed but nodded. "All right, I trust you." We hugged, and I could feel the tension in his shoulders ease a bit. A week later, David had to go on a business trip to Hong Kong for his father's company. As soon as David flew out, Laura and her boyfriend Rick showed up, just as his parents had promised. "Hey, Maria," Laura said with a smirk, walking in without knocking. "We're moving in to keep an eye on the place. You know, since you'll be leaving soon." I forced a smile. "Welcome, Laura, Rick. Just one thing, don't go into the locked room or touch anything there, okay?" Laura's eyes lit up with curiosity. Why not? What's in there? Just family stuff, I said, trying to sound casual. She made a sly face and nodded. Sure, we won't touch it. For the next week, I tried to get along with them, but it was tough. They treated the place like a party house, spending David's father's money and having a blast. Every night was the same, drinking, loud music, and their constant attempts to put me down. Laura spent a lot of time near the locked room, smoking and clearly itching to get inside. She tried to act casual, but I could see the curiosity eating at her. Every time she made a move toward the door, I was there, making sure she couldn't sneak in. A week later, I decided it was time to put my plan into action. I walked into the living room where Laura and Rick were lounging. Hey, I'm going to visit a friend for a few days, I said, grabbing my coat. I'll come back later for my things. Laura's eyes sparkled with glee. Really? That's great. Have fun. I nodded, keeping my face neutral. Thanks. Just remember, don't go into the locked room. Yeah, we got it, Laura said, practically shooing me out the door. I left the apartment and checked into a nearby hotel, finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. I knew Laura's curiosity would get the better of her, and she'd try to get into that room the moment I was gone. Settling into my hotel room, I felt a strange mix of anxiety and satisfaction. I knew the next few days would be critical, but I was ready for whatever came next. David trusted me, and I was determined to see this through, no matter what. The morning after I left the apartment, I got a video call from Laura. I answered it, not sure what to expect, but ready for anything. Laura's face popped up on the screen, looking way too pleased with herself. She was standing in the middle of the now empty locked room, grinning like a cat that caught the canary. Hey Maria, guess what? She said, her voice dripping with smugness. I broke the lock and threw all your crap out. Oh, and I changed the locks on the front door. Good luck getting back in now. I couldn't help it, I burst out laughing. Laura's smug expression faltered, confusion replacing her glee. What's so damn funny? She snapped. I wiped a tear from my eye, still chuckling. Laura, you clueless fool. I took all my stuff with me. That room wasn't mine. It was packed with your dad's things. He specifically told me not to touch any of it. Her face turned ghostly white. What? No, you're lying. Nope, I said, smirking. Those were your dad's precious belongings. He made it clear they were off limits. Laura's eyes widened in horror. She turned to Rick, who was lounging in the background. Rick, you moron. We've got to get those things back from the trash, now. Rick jumped up, looking panicked. What do you mean? We tossed everything last night. It's probably all gone by now. I watched the chaos unfold, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. Laura, maybe start thinking about what your dad will do when he finds out you trashed his stuff. Laura's face crumpled, and she began to cry, her shoulders shaking with sobs. This can't be happening. We're so screwed. I couldn't hide my satisfaction as I watched her meltdown. Well, Laura, maybe next time you'll listen to people when they warn you. With that, I ended the video call, feeling a wave of relief and triumph. Finally, karma had caught up with Laura, and it was a sight to see. I leaned back in my hotel chair, savoring the moment. It felt good to see her get a taste of her own medicine. After David got back from his business trip, he came straight to my hotel. We decided to head back to the apartment together, hoping to finally sort out the mess Laura had caused. As we arrived at the apartment, we were greeted by flashing lights and police officers. We walked up to find Laura, looking disheveled and panicked, talking to the police. Rick stood next to her, looking just as freaked out. Laura was waving her arms, trying to explain something. It was a break-in, she was saying, her voice shaky. All the valuable stuff from the locked room was stolen. Just then, Mr. Anderson pulled up, his face a mask of fury and concern. He stormed over to the police, demanding to know what was going on. "What's all this about a robbery?" he barked. One of the officers turned to him. "Sir, the young lady here claims the apartment was broken into and items were stolen from a locked room." Mr. Anderson's eyes narrowed. "We need to check the surveillance footage. There are cameras installed in the apartment." Laura and Rick turned pale at the mention of cameras. They exchanged panicked glances, clearly realizing the trap they had walked into. The officer nodded. "All right, let's take a look at that footage." We all went up to the apartment, and Mr. Anderson quickly accessed the camera system. As the footage played, it showed Laura and Rick breaking into the locked room and throwing out all the items. A heavy silence fell over the room as everyone watched the damning evidence. Laura's face was a picture of horror, and Rick looked like he was about to faint. Mr. Anderson's face turned a dangerous shade of red. "Laura, what the hell have you done?" he roared. Laura started to cry, her voice shaking. "Dad, I'm sorry. I thought these were Maria's things. We didn't know what else to do. You lied to the police. You tried to stage a robbery to cover up your stupidity." Mr. Anderson exploded. "I can't believe this." The police officer cleared his throat, looking stern. "Ma'am, you've made a false report. That's a serious offense." Mr. Anderson shook his head, his voice trembling with rage. "Because of your actions and this deceit, I renounce you, Laura. You're disinherited. You are no longer my daughter." Laura collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. "Dad, no. Please don't do this." The officer nodded to his partner, and they started filling out a report. "We'll need to take you both in for questioning about this false report." Rick's face went white. David squeezed my hand, his face a mix of anger and relief. "I can't believe she tried to pull this off." As the police escorted Laura and Rick out of the apartment, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It had been a long, hard road, but we had finally come out on the other side, stronger and more united than ever. David's father did exactly what he said he would. He cut Laura off completely. No more money, no future inheritance. Her boyfriend ditched her too, seeing as he was only in it for the cash. Now Laura stuck in a tiny, run-down apartment, scraping by on her own. It's a tough break, but she had it coming. Meanwhile, David and I decided it was best to cut ties with his controlling parents, at least for a while. David quit his father's company and finally opened his own veterinary clinic, something he's always dreamed of. I'm so proud of him. And as for me, I landed a great job as a translator for a big international company. We're both working hard, but it's worth it for the freedom we have now. We're still in a rented apartment, but it feels like home because it's ours. No more constant surveillance or judgmental eyes watching our every move. We're making plans for the future, like buying our own house and starting a family. It's exciting to think about what's ahead. One morning, over breakfast, David and I were talking about our plans. "Maria, have you thought about where you'd like to buy a house?" he asked, sipping his coffee. I nodded. "Yeah, somewhere quiet, but not too far from the city." "What about you?" "I'm thinking the same," he said, grinning. "A place with a big yard for the dogs." I laughed. "Of course, you'd want space for the dogs." "That's fine by me. And what about kids? Are we still thinking a couple of years down the line?" David looked thoughtful. "Yeah, I think that's a good plan. Let's get settled first, make sure the clinic is running smoothly, and then we can start thinking about kids." I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Sounds perfect. We've got time, and we're building a good life together." Later that day, we visited his new clinic. It was a cozy place, already bustling with clients and their pets. I watched David in his element, caring for animals and talking to their owners. He looked so happy and fulfilled. One weekend, we decided to visit some open houses, just to get a feel for what was out there. We found a few places we liked, and it was exciting to imagine our future home. "Maria, can you picture it?" David asked as we stood in the backyard of a charming house. Kids playing here, maybe a dog running around? I smiled, feeling a warm glow inside. Yeah, I can. It feels right, doesn't it? Absolutely, he said, putting an arm around me. We're building something real, something lasting. As we left the house, I felt a sense of contentment and anticipation. We were on the right path, and the future looked bright.